And everybody should now see the introductory thing where it says Sage 100 Year-End Processing Webinar. Again, like I said, we're going to kind of cover period end and year-end processing and kind of go over some tips and tricks and whatnot as you kind of close your modules. If any questions come up during the presentation, if you could just submit those questions either through the Q&A portion on the Zoom there or on the chat, either one, we'll make sure to address those because we have a little Q&A session at the end for any questions that people might have. So we'll move on here, and this is an agenda of what we're going to cover today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is order of closing, and that's referring to what order you would close your modules as you're going through your period and year-end closings here. Then we're going to get into specifically some period end and year-end processing notes, and what we're going to talk about there are for the modules you see listed below there. We're going to kind of get in more detail about what it means to close the period, what it means to close the year for each of those modules, some things that you should do, things you want to look out for. So that's one thing that we'll kind of go over. We'll talk about some of the online help and how you can get some help out there. And then, like I mentioned, we'll kind of close on a Q&A session here. So in terms of what order you should close your modules, this is a list kind of that I put together that kind of goes over somewhat of an order of how you should close your modules. If you don't, so you start at the top of bill of material and then you kind of work your way down, to general ledger. If you do not have one of these modules, obviously you just skip that one and move on to the next one that you do have. You'll notice that I highlighted bill of material, work order, and barcode because those modules don't have a period end, year end processing per se, meaning there's not a menu called period end processing and an option called period end, year end processing. So in terms of what you're going to do to close those particular modules is you just want to make sure you have all the work for the year or the period you're closing completed in those modules before you start closing the rest of the modules below that. And then the reason these modules are listed in the order that they are, it's because modules above will feed data down to modules below. So that's why you notice number 4 and 5, sales order and purchase order, are listed above inventory management because sales order and purchase order affect inventory. So you close those modules before you close inventory. That's also why purchase order is above accounts payable because data from PO flows down to accounts payable, and same thing of why sales order is ahead of accounts receivable because data from the sales order module flows down into accounts receivable, and so on and so forth. And then you close general ledger last because all the modules affect general ledger because all the data flows down into the general ledger module for your financial reports. Okay, some period end and year end processing notes, some things to kind of look out for or be careful about. First thing, always make sure you have a full backup of your Sage 100 system before you perform any period end or year end processing tasks. Because after you close a period or a year, the only way that you can reverse that process is by going to a backup and restoring. Okay, so once you say close that module and it goes through and does all its processing, there's no way of saying, okay, unclose that module because I need to now process some additional data in that month for that module. There is one exception to that, and then we'll talk about that a little bit later, but the one exception is the general ledger module, and we'll talk about some stuff, how that comes into play a little bit later on here. So for each of the modules, period end and year end processing are both run from that module's period end menu, and then underneath that period end menu there will be an option called period end processing. So let me do one thing here. Let me bring this up. So for instance, if I go to general ledger, I go to period end, there's an option here called period end processing. And if I go to accounts payable, period end, there's period end processing. And I would see the same thing in AR, sales order, purchase order on down the line. The system is smart enough to know whether it needs to perform a year-end processing or a period-end processing. And the way it determines that is when you are in that particular module, it'll look at the setup options out here. Okay, so I'm in accounts payable, for instance. So it goes out here and looks at what the current period is you're sitting in. If you're sitting in periods 1 through 11 in this case, the system knows to perform a period end close, not a year end close. If you are sitting in the last period of a year, the system knows to perform a year end processing as opposed to a period end processing. So older versions of Sage 100, you had to make that determination by clicking on period end or year end processing. And there was some warnings built into it to prevent you from closing the wrong stuff, but they have that all kind of out there now for you automatically. Where you just run one option and it goes and does the appropriate thing. Your period end dates, those are determined out in the general ledger module underneath the setup menu, underneath the fiscal year maintenance. Okay. So it says here also pay extra attention to the different number of years to retain. Well, okay, we'll jump back that one a minute. Let's look at what I'm talking about here. So general ledger, setup menu, fiscal year maintenance. This is where you define your individual fiscal year or calendar years. Okay, so if you're a calendar year or fiscal year, you got to define these periods out here. And this is where it gets the ending date for whatever period that it's closing. Okay, so that's where it's pulling that information from. So if you're not a calendar year, you just adjust these dates accordingly for the year that you start. And then as new years get created, it will copy the year prior's data over into the next year for the layout of that next year. If you're a calendar year, you're all set because it makes the appropriate changes. If you're a fiscal year in and you're not always closing on the same day for each month, you might have to go in here and adjust the ending dates for each of those. Okay. So this is important. I started to mention this before and I kind of stopped. So important. You pay extra attention to the different number of years to retain history options in the various module setup options. Okay. So what that is dealing with is underneath each of these modules, there's a setup menu and then there's that module's options. So we'll look at a couple of them here. So, like right here, years to retain general ledger history. I have that set to 5 for this company. What that means is first year, it'll keep the history because there's, keep up to 5, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, it'll keep all that. But when I go to close my 5th year and I'm starting my 6th year, it'll start dropping off the other, the older year and then keep working its way back based on the number of years you said to maintain this history. Okay, so that's important because, if you have this set to too low of a number and then you perform a year-end processing and you don't realize until maybe a couple of days, a couple of weeks, even maybe a month or two down the road, where's all my history from 5 years ago? So I'm not trying to look at it, or 6 years ago, and it's not out there because this number of years was set to a number lower than what you probably wanted. At that point, there's really nothing you can do for the old history because you kind of already been processing since then. You can come out here and adjust this number to a higher number at that point in time, and that'll then take care of future closes to make sure the history stays out there, but it won't recall that history that got purged out. And that's on all the modules. There'll be different years or months or days to retain history. So that's where it's at in GL. And if I go to like accounts receivable, and then go into options. I will have different things out here on the history tab, years to retain customer history, years to retain salesperson history, years to retain cash receipts history. There's also this months to retain paid invoices. So that's a little different. That's months, not years. So I always recommend when I'm working with clients or I'm setting up a client system, up front, I'll set that to a really high number, because you can always come back at any point in time and say, okay, we have 12 years of history out here, and we really only need 7 of them. Can we set that down to 7? And you adjust it down to 7, and next time you perform a period end close, then years 8 through 12 would get purged off, right? So it'll catch itself back up and clean itself up. So, but as I mentioned before, if you have it set to a lower number and it purges data, you've kind of already lost that data. Okay. So that's that right there. The current period and year for each module, I just showed you that before. It's underneath that module's setup options. And it's usually on the first tab up in the top right is always kind of where it's at. And that's where you know what your current year and your current period is for the module that you're in. Okay, general ledger module. So here's what occurs in the general ledger module when you're doing a period end or a year end processing, because it'll kind of can do a couple of different things. So any account in your chart of accounts that has a status of deleted will be removed during the year-end processing if the account has no activity. Okay, and it says this is based on transaction history, retention options, and the GL options. Any account flagged as deleted with no activity are automatically removed from the system. So what this means is when you're on a GL account, there is a status field here where an account can be active, inactive, or deleted. Okay, if you go and flag an account and say that it's deleted, then what will happen is it'll be flagged as deleted. It won't let you process any data to that account because you flagged it as deleted. However, it won't delete the account if you have used that account in the last X years that you're retaining history. As long as there's history out there for that account, it will not purge the account because that will cause out of balance situations in your prior financials. Okay, so it'll sit out there until the history's been purged out, then it removes those accounts that are flagged as being deleted. This is another thing to be kind of careful of. Copy actual, make sure how you have this copy actual to default budget at year-end checkbox is set up in the general ledger options. So what that's dealing with is out underneath of general ledger, underneath of the setup options, on the budget tab here, there is a copy actual to default budget at year-end. Okay. And that will do exactly what it says. It'll copy actual numbers to the default budget at year-end. So if we're closing 2022, for instance, okay, and we have our default budget is set up as the original budget, then let's say we had this checkbox here checked. Then when we closed 2022 for general ledger, it would take the actual numbers for the 2022 year and make them be the 2023 original budget numbers because we had this checkbox checked and we had this checked as being our default. So kind of a bad thing, right? So I've gotten this support call from clients before where they accidentally had checked that box. They put their budget for the next year in, towards the end of the, prior year. So in 2022, they put in their 2023 budget numbers. They didn't close GL maybe until like March or so. So they've had these budget numbers out there for a long time. And then all of a sudden my budget numbers don't look right. Well, if you recently done anything, yeah, I just closed my general ledger. Well, you find out that that checkbox is checked and you just kind of overrode your budget and numbers with the actual numbers from the prior year. So be careful with that because it'll override them if you have that set. Options for resetting journal numbers are performed. So that's dealing with out in the GL options. There is, so when you make a journal entry or you do a register, like a cash receipts register or a check register or an invoice register, there's a number assigned to them. This happens at potentially year end or period end if you tell it to reset those numbers for the journals and the registers. If you say year end, it does it at year end. If you say period end, it does it at period end. If you say never reset, it never resets them. Okay. The next thing is dealing with non-financial accounts. So non-financial accounts are things that are not financial in nature that you want to track about your business. So it might be things like number of employees, or it might be if you're in, like, say, a busing industry, number of buses. I've had clients that are in the healthcare industry that had things like patient days or number of beds. Okay, so they want to track those numbers each month because they use that as non-financial numbers on their financial statements. So when you set accounts up, you can flag them as non-financial accounts. Okay. So when you set your accounts up here, these can be flagged as non-financial accounts. And if they're set as non-financial accounts, which this one is not, there is this clear balances checkbox that you can set. Okay. And if you have a non-financial account set to where you check this checkbox, then when you close your year, it'll start the next year with that account at 0. If you don't check that box, then the ending balance from the previous year carries over as the starting balance for the next year. Okay. So that's what that's dealing with. And non-financial accounts are really nice things to, be able to put non-financial data out there to be able to track on your reports. Transaction history beyond a number of years will be removed. We already looked at where that was at. General ledger module, reopen periods and years. So the general ledger module, this is at the very beginning, I said, once you close a period or a year for the modules, you can't undo it. General ledger is the one difference where you can reopen a year. Okay. So let's say you close the year and then you realize I still have these adjusting entries that I need to make that I just got back from my accountant. You can reopen that year, make those entries, and then reclose it. So when reopening a closed general ledger year, okay, this is important. It's only possible if you have retained detailed history for the prior year out there, because if the history's gone, you can't do it. You reopen the GL periods and or years by manipulating the current fiscal year and current period in the options. We'll talk about that here in a second. If you reopen a prior period, then you just need to reset the current period field once you make your adjusting entries. This is very important, this last note here. If you reopened a prior year, then you will need to reclose the year again once you made your adjusting entries. After you reclose the year, you then need to reset the current period field back to the current period. So let's talk about that in a minute. So where you deal with that at is out here underneath the general ledger module, general ledger options, kind of where we've been hanging out here. There is this current fiscal year and current period. Okay, first scenario. Let's say that I needed to remake some journal entries in period 1. Okay, all I would do is come in here, say period 1, say accept, go into general journal entry, make my journal entries, post them in January. When I'm done, I can come right back to my options and just rechange this back to 5 and say accept, and I'd be okay. Okay, because I stayed inside the same year. If I needed to reopen period 12 of 2024, because I need to make some adjusting entries, I would come out here and go 2024, period 1, say accept, come out here to general journal entry, make my journal entries in period 12 of 2024, post them. Since I crossed years, I then have to come back to period end processing and reclose 2024 through the period end processing. That is very important that you do that, because if you do not do that, then the accounts that you affected with your adjusting journal entries at the end of 2024, if it's a balance sheet account, the ending balance for those accounts will now not match the beginning balance for 2025, because that adjustment didn't flow over. That adjusted balance didn't flow over. If it's a P&L account that we adjusted, and those P&L accounts get closed out to retained earnings, so our retained earnings balance will be off by the amount of those adjustments because it didn't close it out. Okay, so that's very important to make sure you do that, reclose that year. And once you did that and you came out here, you'd be sitting in something like that where it said period 1 of 2025. Now we're back in the current year. I don't need to then close January, February, March, April, May again, or April again, because I'm now in 2025. I can now just come out here and make that be period 5 again and say accept. Okay, so very important, this last note, make sure if you cross years, you have to close the year so that the numbers roll forward, then just move your period back to the period you were in for the current year when you go back into your options. Allocations, in general, so what allocations are, that's where you post things to like a summary account, and then later on you do what's called an allocation to distribute that from that summary account out to the detail accounts underneath of that summary account based on percentages, units, other GL accounts, whatever. So the example is when the telephone bill comes in, the AP data entry clerk puts it all to the general telephone expense account to make it easy during data entry. But you have an allocation set up out there where you say, take it from this overall telephone expense account and break it down to these 5 detailed telephone expense accounts based on this certain percentage. So when you run your allocations at year end, it'll then, or period end, it'll basically do that distribution for you. Allocations are either manual or automatic. If they're manual, you determine when they run by running it through general journal entry. If they're automatic, you determine that when they run by running the allocations off of the period end menu right here. Okay. And if you have allocations set up and you have not run them yet, when you go in to do a period end processing for the general ledger module, it'll tell you, are you sure you want to do this because you haven't run your allocations yet? So you will get a warning. You can say, yeah, I want to go ahead and do that, but it'll at least warn you. Accounts payable. Okay. The following occurs during period end and year end for accounts payable. So in AP, you have the ability, just like we talked about GL accounts, you could flag as active, inactive, or deleted. You can flag vendors as temporary vendors. That means you set them up. You're going to do some invoices for them. You're going to pay those invoices, but you don't want to keep those vendors out there long term. Once you've paid those invoices, you want to get rid of that vendor. So if you flag a vendor as a temporary vendor and that vendor has a 0 balance, then that vendor is automatically purged out when you do your period end and year end processing. Any check, this goes back, some of these things now go back to our number of years and number of months to maintain history. Check history information is cleared as of the period ending date. Vendor electronic payment history is removed based on the number of years to retain electronic payment history out in the options. Vendor purchase history is removed based on number of years to retain purchase history out in the options. Open invoices with a 0 balance are removed based on number of days to retain paid invoices out in the options. And then if you're retaining invoice history, then all current year information is updated to the last year fields. Also, any history with no current year activity is removed based on the options. So again, those bullet points 2 through, I guess, 6 there are all dealing with the number of days, number of months to retain history out in that module. Okay. When you're closing your when you're closing your accounts payable module, Make sure that you use the accounts payable trial balance report to tie out to the accounts payable general ledger account or accounts, not the aged payables report. Okay, that's important because I'll get that call from clients a lot of times too. I'm trying to balance my aged invoice report to my GL AP account, but it doesn't balance. Well, it could be because there's an issue, or it could be just it's a posting problem. Think about this for a minute. You're in AP invoice data entry. You roll in, you're already into the next period, for instance. Okay. So when November, say we hit November 30th, a couple weeks ago here, right? The first week or 10 days or so of December, we're still getting invoices that have an invoice date of November from our vendors. Okay. When you go into AP invoice data entry, you put in the invoice date of November 30th, right? And you put in your posting, and when you go to update that, let's say you've already closed November. So when you go to post that, you post it with a posting date of December. That is when it hits your general ledger. Okay. So if you tried to compare your aged invoice report, which would include that for November, because the invoice date was November, and you tried to compare that to your ending balance in November, they'd be off by the amount of that invoice because it did not hit general ledger until December because of our posting date. The trial balance goes off the posting date as well, not the invoice date, which is why you want to use that report to tie to your general ledger, not the aged invoice report. Okay. So as I said down here at the bottom, these reports can get out of balance from each other if you have a transaction with an invoice date in 1 month, but a posting date in the other month. Okay, 1099s. So the printing of your vendor 1099s is independent of closing of the accounts payable year. You do it as part of when you do it as part of the 12/31 year end, potentially period and close, but they're not tied together, right? So the system tracks a separate 1099 calendar year, which is separate from the GL fiscal year, because you might not be a 12/31 year-end company, but you still have to report your 1099s from 1/1 through 12/31. So your 1099 year is always a calendar year ending on 12/31. When you go to run your 1099s, you can use Atrix, which is the 1099 W-2 printing software tool that comes with Sage now. You can use Atrix to print and or electronically file your 1099s from within inside of Sage 100. And there's kind of different things you can do out there between printing them and then you mail them, or you can even have Atrix do everything from the printing to the electronic filing to the mailing to everything for you. It's kind of like an a la carte. You pick and choose what you want when you're out there. Accounts receivable module. You're going to notice that a lot of the things on the AR module here are very similar to the accounts payable because those modules kind of mirror each other in the way they act. So temporary customers with zero balance are automatically purged out, just like in AP. The one difference is there is a checkbox in AR that says retain temporary customers with paid invoices. So even if somebody is a temporary customer and they have no balance, but they have an invoice history out there and you have this checkbox checked in the options, it won't purge it. That was not a feature in AP. And then you have your purges happen, your monthly cash receipts, your customer sales history, your salesperson sales history, open invoices with a zero balance that are beyond number of days retained invoices. So bullets 2, 3, 4, and 5 there are all dealing with number of days, number of months to retain history. Okay, when you're closing your AR module, this is exactly what I just talked about on the AP side. Okay, so almost verbatim. So because it's the same exact thing. You have an invoice date on an AR or a sales order invoice. Okay, that's what determines what aged invoice report it shows up on. The posting date when it determines when it's going to hit the general ledger and when it shows up on the trial balance report. So again, use your trial balance report for both AR and AP when tying out to your general ledger, because it goes off the posting date. Inventory management module. So there's a thing out there called negative tiers. Okay, so what are negative tiers? So a negative tier is when you're dealing with an item that is a FIFO item or a LIFO item or a lot item. Okay, and it's when you sell more goods than what the system thinks you have on hand. Okay, and you might think, well, how can that happen? How can I sell? Obviously, I had to have the item on the shelf to be able to sell it in order to ship it, right? Well, it could be because maybe the goods showed up at your dock, they got put on the shelf, but the receipt of goods didn't happen yet in the system. So the system might think you have zero. Somebody goes out and grabs them, ships them, the invoices get updated, so that reduces your inventory. So what'll happen is the last inventory tier you were on will go negative. Okay, when you now do the receipt of goods after the fact, you now have a positive tier out there as well. So you have a negative tier and a positive tier. The difference between those two is what you actually have on hand now. But you have this negative tier sitting out there that you can fix by using the inventory negative tier adjustment to clean those up. So out underneath of inventory, if I go to period end and I run this inventory negative tier report, okay, this will show me any negative tier I have out there in inventory. So for this item 1001-HON-H252, I over distributed 999. I over distributed 17. Oh no, I looked at the wrong one. Sorry. This is what's on hand. I over distributed 8, 1, 17, 1, 350, and 1. This is what's on hand. So notice I went over on this tier because I hadn't received this 990 in yet. So on hand in total, it's going to be the difference between those two. This can't offset because it's still negative, 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 negative. But this one can be fixed. So that's where this negative tier adjustment comes into play. So let's first look at that item. I just want to show you something out here real quick. All right, if I go to my cost detail, here's the negative tier over distributed. Here's the positive tier right here of 998. So the on hand was the difference between those two of 990. Notice how the item cost here between the different tiers are the same. 34.25 and 34.25. So when it applies this positive balance to this negative balance, I won't have an adjustment to the general ledger because the costs were the same. If it got issued out at a higher cost than what the newer one came in at, or it got issued out at a lower cost than what the newer one came in at, I would have an adjustment to my inventory adjustment account and my inventory account for the difference between those two, because it has to make an adjustment out there. Okay, so if I run this report, I should just see that one out there that it can fix, because we saw the other ones didn't have enough to fix. So here's that item. It had a negative tier of 8. It's going to apply 8 of them to it. It happened at 34.25. The positive was at 34.25. So I have no GL effect in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to update that. Yes. Do I want to run a daily transaction register? I'll say yes. And you'll notice when I run this, it's going to tell me that the file is empty because the costs were the same. Okay, but let me go off this tab now. And come back on it. Notice how the over distribute now is at 0, and this went from 998 to 990 because it applied those transactions to each other. Okay. All it did was apply that to it. So there's the apply of a negative tier, the positive and negative, the transactions out there. Okay. So a good thing to use, to run, I tell clients run inventory, run that, at least as you're getting towards your year end or period end, just to kind of clean that up. Sales order module. So during period end year end processing, the sales order recap is purged based on the years to retain it out there that you have in the history. Sales order history is purged based on number of years to retain sales order history. So that's, again, just going back to the options and a number of years or periods to maintain that. Any expired master or repeating orders are automatically purged based on the expire dates. Okay. So if you have any master orders or repeating orders out there, you have an expire date on those, and they will get purged out if they have an expire date on or before the period that you're closing. Purchase order, kind of very similar. You have where it maintains some history out here based on number of years, number of months to maintain, just like sales order. And then you also have master and repeating orders you can set up for PO, and they can get purged out based on the expire date as well. All right. Now, another thing with the purchase order module is what is called the purchases clearing report. So the purchases clearing report is when the receipt of goods quantity for a line is different than the receipt of invoice quantity for a line. If those numbers are different, it will show up on the purchases clearing report. What happens is let's say you have a purchase order out there, you do a receipt of goods. What happens is it debits inventory for the value of that line. It credits the PO clearing account. All right. When the invoice comes in and you do a receipt of invoice against those lines, it credits the AP account for the value of those lines, and it backs out the PO clearing based, on the amount that it went in at during the receipt of goods. If there is a difference between them, then it will hit a variance account out in product line maintenance. Okay. Now, when you have it in between stages where you've done your receipt of goods, but not your receipt of invoice, and you have a value sitting out that PO clearing report, you need to compare that report to the general ledger account called purchases clearing and tie that and reconcile that. And where you get to that is underneath the period purchase order. Okay, period end. There's a purchases clearing report. And I'm going to preview this, and you're going to see this will show us all the items where the quantity received is different than the quantity invoiced. That's why all these lines are showing up out here. And this is the value that should be sitting in my PO clearing for each of these lines. And I have a total here. I want to compare that total to my GL account for the purchases clearing report. Okay. So good thing to not let that get out of whack right away, because that can get out of whack on some old invoices, and you got some things to clean up. It kind of gets a little harder at the end. Let's talk about payroll for a minute. Payroll is not period end, it's quarter end. So you have quarter end processing and year end processing. So when you're running a quarter end processing, then the current quarter that's out in the payroll options will advance to the next quarter. Any time off accrual values are updated based on the settings for allow time off accruals from field. Okay, when you're doing a year-end close, so in addition to doing these two things, it'll also do these items right here. So the field showing the employee's year-to-date direct deposit amount is cleared. Terminated employees are removed from the employee file if there's no history associated with their records. Pension plan deductions, if you have the reset balance at year-end checkbox set, it resets those out in deductions. If an employee has no history for a deduction, the deduction is removed from the employee record. If the calendar year is selected and the reset time off, out in payroll options, then any employee's unused time is carried over to the next year up to any limits that you set. History records are purged if they're older than the number of years to retain. Again, back to their history and number of years and months to retain. And then the current processing year is advanced to the next year, and the quarter is set to 1. Okay. Just like we talked about 1099s for AP, for payroll, you have your W-2s. You can also run them through Atrix as well. And then just like where you had the ability of printing your W-2s or having Atrix print them for you, you can have, it's all a la carte there too. You can have Atrix print them for you, or you print them, or you can have Atrix file them for you. So that all can be done all through Atrix. And then when you're in Atrix, whether it's 1099 or W-2s, they maintain the forms. Okay, so as adjustments to the forms kind of happen at year end, they'll automatically show up in Atrix. And you'll notice that when you go into Atrix from time to time, where it'll tell you there's an update out there and you have to process or load it. And it'll basically download the new forms for you. For more information, detailed information on the period end, year, and process for each module, you can go to the help that's built in out there. So, you know, and I made a little note here. Once you get into the help system, you can search on the topics you're looking for. For example, you can search on general ledger, period end processing, and return a list of topics, including GL, period end and year end processing checklist. So basically, where am I at here? Here. If you go out here and go to help, okay, and then go to your help topics, you can start doing some searches out here to start finding, you know, year end, for instance. You know, start taking you to individual, here's your period end, quarter end, and year end processing checklists. Okay, so different things out there. So that's one way of getting into it. Another way is when you're on period end processing, for instance, and you have one of these screens up right here, you can click on the question and go to perform period end, year end processing, and it'll take you into it from there as well. Okay. So there's different ways of getting out into the help, and that you can go out there and look at some of the help topics out there. When you go to any of these period end processing screens, so I happen to be in purchase order, it'll tell you for that module, you'll be performing period X in the date, and it's getting this period from that module setup options for the current period, and it's getting the ending date here from out in general ledger fiscal year maintenance that we talked about before. Okay. I guess that brings us up to, we're getting towards the end here. So I guess we're at the question and answer part here. So if anybody has any questions, if you haven't submitted them already, submit them out there either through the Q&A portion or the chat portion of Zoom, and we'll get them answered. Do we have anything out there, Betsy?
I am not seeing anything.
Okay. Okay. So we have no questions out there right now. If after this class you're looking through this information further and you had a question, you know, reach out to whoever your main contact here is at Martin and Associates, that, you know, you could ask them. You know, you could, if you don't have their address or you don't have anybody that you're working with specifically for Martin and Associates, you could reach out to the info at martinandassociates.com as well. And then we can then filter it from there, or funnel it from there to the appropriate person to follow up with you, whether it's me or whoever else, to answer your question. Okay.
Just one other quick thing. You guys will receive the recording in an email follow-up, and as well as the slide deck following this presentation.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out today to join the webinar. Sorry again for the initial little technical difficulty there of getting it up and running. I apologize. That was my fault. good luck with your year-end close coming up if you're a calendar year-end closing. And again, if you have any questions or anything we can help you guys with, just reach out and we're here to help. Thanks, guys.